Okay, welcome AP World History. This is actually chapter 24, not chapter 23. This is from a different edition. Most importantly, the title here is The Transformation of Europe. It's a very important chapter. There's a huge fundamental change going on in Europe, centered basically around the Reformation. All right, so let's get into the Reformation. Now, the Reformation is this event that really began by a solitary monk named Martin Luther. And you can see the years that he's active there on your screen. And he was a pretty devout guy who and really he was upset with the practices of the church. The church was this enormous, powerful institution that had really ruled over the Middle Ages for almost 1,000 years as the single most powerful institution. And they were beginning to do some things that he didn't care for. And so he sat down one night, and it took him a couple of nights to do this. And he wrote something called the 95 Thesis, basically just ways that he thought the church could be improved. Now, the one thing that really set him off more than anything was the sale of indulgences. Basically, you had guys like Johann Tetzel, who are they work for the church and are trying to raise money to build cathedrals. And, uh, and if you were a rich person, well, and you did sins, well, then you could pay your way out of your sins and you'd spend less time in purgatory. This was something that the poor people couldn't afford to do. And basically, it was a way to pay for bad behavior, if you will, but it was overlooked because you were helping out the church, you were helping out God. And Martin Luther thought that this was fundamentally wrong. And so it's going to lead to his 95 Thesis. Now, very importantly, thanks to Johann Gutenberg's printing press, when Martin Luther goes and nails his thesis to the castle wall, it's going to not stay there. It's not going to be local in Wittenberg, Germany. It's where this goes on. It's going to get picked up by somebody, and they're going to take it to the printing press, and they're going to hammer out all these copies of the 95 Thesis, and they're going to circulate, and it is going to create this massive movement. It gets to the point, in the beginning, Pope Leo X wasn't really worried about Martin Luther, just this lowly monk. But thanks to the printing press, this thing goes much further than he ever thought it would. So he ends up excommunicating Martin Luther, kicking him out of the church. But that's fine with Martin Luther because Martin Luther has a much more personal relationship with God. He believes that the Bible is the highest source of authority, not the Pope, which is an attack on the Pope's power. And he also believes that people can speak directly with God, which was not something practiced in the Catholic Church up to this point. You pretty much had to go to the priest who was an intermediary between you and God. So this is going to spread. There are a lot of people who are attracted to this more personal relationship with God, certainly. And you're going to see that a lot of princes and kings and people get in on the act as a way to gain power for themselves. Now, the roots of the reform, again, the church has become incredibly wealthy, incredibly powerful, and unfortunately, in many ways, very greedy and corrupt. And because of that, they are going to face criticism. And there is a demand for more personal involvement with God, being able to talk to God and not listening to someone speak to you from a Bible that you can't read. You have all these issues going on. People are essentially just tired of it. Martin Luther, he's going to expand his critique. We're going to end up closing some monasteries here. Very big part of this movement is translating the Bible into vernacular, which is the common language. Now Germans are reading a German Bible. And since they see the Bible as the highest authority, they can check the power of their priest instead of a priest reading from a book, written in Latin. This is a really big deal. This is basically a power play. Again, I told you the German princes, they are getting involved. For them, this is a chance to gain power at the expense of the church. And so many of them are going to support reform throughout Germany. However, there are going to be princes who are devout Catholics who see this attack as an attack on their faith. Unfortunately, what you're going to get here is a religious civil war that's going to kill millions of people. Now, it doesn't stay just in Germany, and that's important to remember that the Reformation is going to spread throughout much of Europe. It hits Switzerland and the Low Countries. They're the first ones following Germany, and you'll get people like John Calvin and John Knox who are founding, the Calvinist faith and Presbyterians and other Protestant faiths like that. In England, you get King Henry VIII, of course, very famously. He needs an heir to the throne. His first wife, Catherine, has only given him 2 daughters. And so he asked the king for um, a divorce, but that's not allowed in the Catholic Church. Although they do something called an annulment. His wife's brother is a very powerful King Philip II of Spain, and the Pope doesn't want to get into that mess, so he won't grant him the divorce. And so King Henry, because he's already seen Martin Luther's example, decides that, well, the church is already splintered. He'll splinter it some more, and so he breaks away from the church and founds his own by 1560, and he declares himself the head of the Church of England. In France, you get more Protestant action behind the leadership of John Calvin. He codifies, meaning he writes it down, Protestant teachings while in his exile in Geneva, Switzerland. And he basically creates this utopia. It's a very strict place, not a lot of color there. It's all based around service to the Lord. Perhaps not a real fun place to be by most today's people's standards. Scotland, Netherlands, Hungary, they also experience these reform movements. Everybody's kind of domino effect here. Now, the Catholic Church isn't going to sit here and just let this go. There is massive bloodshed on both sides, but the Catholic Church also realizes that if they want to basically stop the bleeding here, they're going to have to change some things about themselves. So the Catholics go through their own reformation, their own change. They redefine their doctrine. They adjust their missionary activities to try to get Protestants, and they're attempting to renew spiritual activity. They do this behind the Council of Trent, periodic meetings to discuss basically how they can make the Catholic Church better and more appealing to people, because essentially people in Europe have a choice. They can still believe in Jesus and believe in God, but they can be Protestants and not Catholics. And so they're basically having to go out there and win converts. Probably the best thing that comes out of the Catholic Reformation is the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits. They're founded by St. Ignatius Loyola. And they are absolutely the best Christian missionaries. Very effective. They are much more willing. They're kind of like the Sufis in Islam. They're much more willing to take on local, like with the Indians. The Corn Mother is just a representation of Jesus, something that wouldn't have been acceptable to other missionaries. The Jesuits were fine with, and so they won a lot of converts to the Catholic religion, which is why much of the Americas is Catholic, mostly obviously in Central and South America. Now, in this time period, unfortunately, we see a lot of witch hunts, and this is usually in areas where you got a lot of tension between Catholics and Protestants. Remember, this is a weapon that's going to see a lot of people die. In late 15th century, development in the belief of the devil having human assistance. That's something that is going on in this time period. And then in the 16th and 17th centuries, you get about 110,000 people put on trial. 45,000 of those are actually put to death. Now, what's very important to remember with the witch hunts is that the vast majority of them were females. And really, this was a very misogynistic movement. It was a way for, people to get rid of widows who, there were women who kind of didn't want to be under the rule of a man. And so they were kind of outcasts in society, and they usually became targets. Also, women that maybe spurned the efforts of a man could sometimes see themselves accused of being a witch. Or if you were just a woman who was a little different, you could also be accused of being a witch. There's several different ways there. Now, most famously, locally, as far as Americans are concerned, is the Salem witch trials, which happens in, I think, 1692. That's the most famous of the ones that happens in America. Now, there were, I think, 19 people that died in the Salem witch trials, including a few men. Occasionally, that would happen. Now, remember that everything we're talking about is going back to the Protestant Reformation, going back to the splinter in the church and what it does to society. The church had been the fundamental basis of society, and it was under attack. And some viewed it positively, and some viewed it very negatively. And so those two sides hate each other because they feel like they've torn apart their house, basically. So the Protestants and Roman Catholics fight in France. There's some religious wars there you can see for a solid 30 years. In 1588, you had the very powerful absolute monarch Philip II of Spain, who attacks England. He does this in an attempt to force England to come back to Catholicism. That's how important it is. Unfortunately for them, this is a turning point in European history. 1588, uh, the Spanish had the most powerful European fleet in the world, the Spanish Armada. Unfortunately for them, Mother Nature was not on their side. They were trapped by a storm, and many of the ship's Spanish fleet was destroyed. The English fleet had trailed in along behind the storm and caught what remained of the Spanish Armada in a cove and basically finished them off. And so they destroyed the mighty Spanish Armada. And this would be a shift in the balance of power in Europe. And it would begin shifting away from Spain and towards England, who would have basically control, who would have the most powerful navy in Europe for the next 300 years. Also in this time period, the Netherlands, they rebelled against Spain. They gained their independence by the year 1610, and they set up basically the Dutch Republic. Again, religion is the root here. You also get the 30 Years' War in this time period. This was a time period when the Holy Roman Emperor, he's trying to attempt to force this group of people called the Bohemians, they're like basically European gypsies, to return to the Roman Catholic Church. But it's one of those things that steamrolls and gets out of control, and all of Europe becomes involved in conflict. The principal battleground, of course, is Germany, because that's the vast majority of the Holy Roman Empire was centered in Germany. Now, there were political and economic issues involved, but approximately 1/3 of the German population is going to die in the 30 Years' War. All right. Again, it is a religious war. It's about 100 years after Martin Luther writes his 95 Theses. Now, this is also a time period where you're going to see the creation of European nation states. Emperor Charles V attempted to revive the Holy Roman Empire. He's trying to make it as the center of Europe. And, he's got different ways that he's going to do this. He's going to try to marry off daughters and sons and cousins and stuff to other important heads of states. He's trying to make these political alliances. In the end, it doesn't really work. But the Protestant Reformation provides cover for local princes to assert greater independence. If you can remember, a theme of the Reformation is that more secular power is gained at the expense of the church. And the Holy Roman Empire gains opposition from France, who has its own views on power in Europe, and the growing power of the Ottoman Empire, which of course is Muslim. Now, unlike China, India, Ottoman Empire, Europe does not develop as a single empire. It's always going to be these individual states. There's almost 40 different European countries today. The lines on the map will change, but there's never going to be, one single empire of Europe. That never happens, ever. In the end, Charles V would end up abdicating his throne, giving it away, and basically moving to a monastery in Spain. So you see a map here of 16th century Europe. You see the size of Spain. You see that France is a large place as well. You see the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. They're labeled the German states. You get your areas of Bohemia and Austria. Just outside of that is Hungary. So you've got a lot going on. What you don't see is a large, powerful empire. That just never happens. Out here, you do see the growing threat of the Ottoman Empire to the Europeans. This really leads into a theme that you should know as absolutism, as absolute monarchs, where monarchs are going to begin ruling in Europe with more power than they've ever had before. They're not going to be checked by the church. Their power is not going to be checked by nobles in most cases. They're going to claim that they rule by divine will and that the people must follow them or they're going against God. And this is going to, stay around for a couple hundred years before you start seeing the Enlightenment period kind of push against it. In Italy, it was well developed. It was an economic power, remember, because of its location in the Mediterranean. Still, England, France, and Spain surge ahead in the 16th century because of innovative new tax revenues. The way they're taxing their people is bringing in a lot of monies. Also, I think that their explorations across the seas certainly has a role to play as well. In England, Henry VIII would issue fines and fees for royal services. He would confiscate monastic holdings and take the wealth there. In France, you had Louis the 11th and Francis the First. They're also putting new taxes on sales, basically a sales tax, what you guys will pay if you go into a convenience store. And they were taxing the profitable salt trade as well. The Spanish Inquisition happens in this time period. Ferdinand and Isabella are the ones who get it going. This is part of the Reconquista, the act of trying to push the Muslims out of Spain and make Spain a bastion for Catholicism. So originally, they're searching for secret practitioners of Judaism or Islam, so not just Muslims, but Jews as well. They would later on search for Protestants because Spain is going to be a Catholic hold. Spread Spanish holdings outside the Iberian Peninsula in the Western Hemisphere. So they're places over here in the Americas. It led to imprisonment and executions. The Inquisition was used to intimidate nobles who, might have been considering Protestantism. They're going to make sure that the smart choice is to be Catholic. Nobody wants to end up getting the blood eagle or any other kind of torture method used by the Spanish Inquisition. They even imprisoned the Archbishop of Toledo. So nobody was too powerful for the Inquisition not to pull them down. Okay, we get a movement towards these constitutional states. England and the Netherlands developed institutions of popular representation. England gets something called a constitutional monarchy. Basically, they have a constitution of sorts that kind of limits the monarchy. In England, the kings there and queens will not be as absolute as kings and queens in other European nations because of this constitution. The Netherlands goes even further. Before America was ever a republic, the Netherlands are a republic. Now, they're a much smaller area, but they're experimenting with something that hasn't been around basically since the time of the Greeks, at least the Athenians and some of the other Greeks that practiced democracy. And I guess the Roman Republic as well, too. All right. In this time period, you get a 7-year brutal English Civil War, which began with opposition to royal taxes, but it still has its religious elements. The Anglican Church, which is the Church of England, founded by Henry VIII and his daughter, Queen Elizabeth, favors these complex rituals, a very complex church hierarchy. But the Calvinist Puritans the Puritans are a very simplistic and uncompromising religious group. And they oppose the Anglican Church, I think, as really being too Catholic. The Puritans believe that they need to purify the church, that it needs completely reformed. King Charles I and the Parliament armies clashed. King Charles I and Parliament did not get along. He's constantly asking them for money, and he doesn't listen to anything they say. And so they fight each other several times. But King Charles will end up losing, and he will be the first European monarch to be publicly beheaded. And the Puritans are going to take over. They will win the English Civil War under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. In the beginning, they were going to set up a republic, essentially, but that didn't happen. What happened instead was a dictatorship under the rule of Oliver Cromwell himself, which lasted until Cromwell's death. This known as the Glorious Revolution. The Puritans take over, like I said, becoming a dictatorship. Eventually, however, monarchy was restored in 1660. However, fighting does resume. There seems to always be fighting in Europe. It's resolved with a bloodless coup called the Glorious Revolution. Basically, what happened was King James II, who was seen as being far too Catholic, he gets deposed. He gets kicked off the throne, and his daughter Mary and her husband, William of Orange, are invited to take the throne. King James leaves. He doesn't choose to fight, and this is why it's a bloodless coup, and it is known as the Glorious Revolution. So you need to know that it's when Mary and her husband Orange, the Protestants, take back the throne here. With their taking of the throne, you're going to see a shared governance between the crown and parliament. So again, it will be a limited monarchy instead of an absolute monarchy here in England. It's a little bit of an outlier compared to some of the other European countries. All right, going back to the Dutch Republic for just a little bit. King Philip II of Spain, he tries to put down these very strict Calvinists in the Netherlands. Remember, Calvinists are a Protestant group. However, large-scale rebellion follows, and by 1581, the Spanish Netherlands are able to declare independence, and they based their government on a representative parliamentary system. So very similar to what America has today. Again, absolute monarchists. We've been talking about it. This theory of divine rights of kings. The French were as absolute as anybody, for sure. You had Cardinal Richelieu, who ruled really instead of King Louis XIII, who was a very weak king. Cardinal Richelieu, who worked for the Catholic Church, made the rules and the laws and enforced it. He was the true power. However, King Louis was the figurehead. Under Richelieu, they destroyed the castles of nobles and crushed aristocratic conspiracy. He weakened the power of the nobles so that the king, hence himself, had more power. They built a bureaucracy to bolster the royal power base. They're going to basically make sure that it's the king who taxes, not the nobles, because the person who has the power to tax has a lot of power. They ruthlessly attacked Calvinists there in France. And then we get the most powerful absolute monarch probably in French history, which is Louis XIV, aka the Sun King. He very famously once said that he was the state. He says, "I am the state." He builds the incredible, just simply magnificent Palace of Versailles. It cost about $2 billion in today's money. Largest building in Europe, had 1,400 fountains. We're going to look closer at the Palace of Versailles in class because it truly is a wonder. 25,000 fully grown trees that were transplanted there. He basically makes his nobles live at the Palace of Versailles, which he builds about 14 miles outside of Paris. He didn't like the city. It smelled. He didn't like it. He wanted to be out at his hunting lodge. So he builds the Palace of Versailles and then forces the nobles to come live with him. This man was so absolutely powerful that when he woke up in the morning, there were upwards of 100 nobles in his bedroom waiting for him to wake up. The rest of the nobles would be outside in the hallways, basically awaiting his pleasure. He treated nobles like servants. They would dress him and put on his wig and his perfumes and stuff. Stuff that's usually reserved for servants. Unfortunately, he was so powerful that the only thing worse than being treated like a dog was if he chose not to see you at all. He could blackball you, and everyone else would ignore you as a noble. So it was the kiss of death. He is the longest reigning monarch in European history. Technically speaking, he became king when he was 4 years old, but he took sole power when he was about 22. But he is going to rule until his 70s. So he was king for a very, very long time. Now, he centered his power there in the court. And again, important nobles were pressured to maintain their presence there in Versailles. When he died, it was pretty much a mixed bag. Everybody was ready to see him go. But he did do some good things for Europe. For France. He made them a powerful military nation and the center of the arts. He was a huge patron of the arts. There were a lot of ballets named after him. He liked being entertained. Absolutism goes to Russia as well. We get the founding of the Romanov dynasty. Remember that the last time we were talking with Russia, I think we were speaking of Ivan the Terrible and how he doomed his line, and it would end up being the Romanovs under Michael Romanov, who founded the dynasty after he messes it all up. Now, there are a couple of important Romanovs you got to know, starting with Peter the Great. With Peter, he's very easy to remember. He's this enormous 6'8" man who has some pretty cool historical anecdotes. But most importantly, what you need to know about him is that his big thing was westernization of Russia. He wants Russia to look like Western Europe. He knows that Russia's behind, that they're backwards, that people view them as hillbillies, and he wants them to catch up, to the point that he goes on something called the Grand Embassy. For 2 years, he goes in disguise himself personally to Western Europe and takes on as many jobs as he can. He works for a shoemaker. He works out on the docks doing manual labor. He is incognito. He's in disguise. And when he comes back, he's going to bring back the things that he found. Well, he brings back Western culture. He likes Western European culture even better than his own Russian culture, which made him a few enemies, but he's very powerful. So nothing that's going to see him assassinated or anything. He's going to force the Russians to cut their beards unless they pay a beard tax, because Western Europeans weren't wearing beards. They were outdated. He knows that it's important to build a new capital. He builds a new capital at St. Petersburg, which gives him a port, which was very important. A little bit later on from him, you get Catherine II, who's also Catherine the Great, a woman ruling this vast nation. She has huge military expansion under her rule, and she takes parts of Poland, which will come back to play when we talk about the World Wars. She, in the beginning, was really kind of what we call an enlightened despot, an enlightened ruler. She was trying social reforms, even to the point where she was trying to end serfdom. She was trying to free the serfs. This was not popular with her nobles. There was an uprising, and eventually she went back on all of that stuff. She tried it, but there was just so much pushback that she eventually said, "Nah, just kidding, guys." Oops, sorry. All right. No imperial authority was there to mediate regional disputes. There was no larger power. And I think that's why you're going to see a lot of conflict here in Europe. You got something called the Peace of Westphalia, which you got to know. This came in to end the 30 Years' War. Basically, what the Peace of Westphalia said was that you had the right as a European to worship as you chose. If you wanted to be Protestant, if you wanted to be Catholic, that's fine. You had that choice. European states were to be recognized as sovereign and equal, religious and other domestic affairs to be protected, as other parts of the Peace of Westphalia. The warfare continues, however. There was opposition to French expansion. They were growing very powerful, which kind of led to the 7 Years' War, which was basically a two-front war. It's a war taking place in Europe, and it's a war taking place in the Americas, in North America, between the colonists and Britain in alliance against the French, and in some cases the Indians. The balance of power in Europe is always a big deal. They can't have any country become too powerful. That's certainly a theme. It's something you're going to see in World War I and World War II. That Germany was becoming too powerful. And with Napoleon, France was becoming too powerful. And you have to kind of have this balance of power. You have huge innovations in military technology, which is going to help Europe advance. They're coming along quite swiftly. Here's a map of Europe after the Peace of Westphalia. Just a few minor differences with the Spanish Netherlands and all that, but not too big of a difference. Rapid population growth due to the Columbian Exchange and things like the potato. As you can see there, it's considered an aphrodisiac, which basically increases sex drive. The potato is not, but they thought it was. I think they just really like potatoes, kind of like me. It replaced bread as the staple diet for many European nations, and better nutrition reduced susceptibility to the plague. One of the reasons the Black Plague was so devastating was that a lot of people were already suffering from famine. Epidemic disease became insignificant for overall population decline by the mid-17th century. So smallpox and things like that, epidemics, that's only going to happen in the other side of the world with the Indians. That's just pretty much done in Europe. So as you can see, there's significant population growth. And today, Europe is a place that has a large population. The continent of Europe is about the size of the country, United States of America. United States of America has 326 million people. Europe has 500 million people. So it's pretty densely populated place. Much of this is due to massive urbanization, people flocking to the cities. And we're going to talk about the role of the Industrial Revolution in all of this here soon. You get early aspects of capitalism. And basically, remember, capitalism is privately owned businesses, a free market where the government doesn't control it. It's private initiative. People will work hard to see their business succeed so that they can get rich. It's all based off of supply and demand, which determines prices. The government doesn't set prices. The market sets the prices. You get the development of banks and these things called stock exchanges. Think of Wall Street here in America. You get joint stock companies, which are very wealthy and very powerful. The English East India Company, the Dutch East India Company. They're a big part of empire building. They're a big reason that their colonies exist in the New World. They're a big reason that America exists. The medieval guilds also get discarded. They fall out of favor. Instead, they're replaced with this putting out system, which is pretty much the early form of the Industrial Revolution. And that's where, like, it happens in textiles first. You know, the owner would buy the cloth and he would give it to a farm wife, and she would take it to her house and spend the week making dresses, and then she would take the dresses back to the owner, and he would sell them. All right, and eventually will give birth to factories and whatnot. But we'll talk about that in more detail later on. What's the impact of capitalism on social order? Well, for rural life out there in the country, it improved access to manufactured goods. So they're actually going to be able to buy more than one set of clothes. You typically had two sets of clothes, your 6 days a week work clothes, one set of those, and then you'd have your Sunday best, a set of clothes that you reserved for church on Sundays. Increasing opportunities in urban cities, centers begin depletion of the rural population. What that means is people begin flocking to the cities. There was opportunity to be had in the cities, a better life to be had in the cities. Inefficient institution of serfdom is abandoned in Western Europe. Basically, this is going to end feudalism, except in Russia. And Russia's going to hold on until the 1800s. Nuclear families replace extended families. Once upon a time, it would be mom, dad, the kids, aunts, uncles, cousins, and all that living together. Now, in this time period, it's more separated. It's what we see today, where it's mom, dad, and the kids for the most part. And everybody will have their own nuclear family. Gender changes as women enter income-earning workforce. Hugely important with the Industrial Revolution as women begin to get jobs there in the beginning in textile factories. It is profoundly significant to world change as women get to enter the workforce. They have been denied this essentially since the Neolithic Revolution in most cases. Obviously you had a few female merchants in different areas and stuff, but now you're going to see working class women able to get their own jobs. Capitalism and morality. You get an important person who basically wrote the book on capitalism, Adam Smith. He argued that capitalism would ultimately improve society as a whole. You could probably argue that he's right as far as what we've seen. But major social change increases poverty in some sectors. Basically, what that means is that in the beginning, the Industrial Revolution has some short-term negative consequences. Life expectancy goes down. There's child labor, spread of diseases because of living conditions. But long-term, it's going to be really, really good. Rise in crimes is short-term because people are desperate because their wages are so low. But for the most part, capitalism is going to be pretty good. All right, switching gears here to a little bit of scientific revolution. You get Nicholas Copernicus, who basically goes against church thinking, and he says that the Earth is not the center of the universe, which was called the geocentric theory. He says the sun is the center of the universe, which is called the heliocentric theory. Not much to do with it in his time period. He dies without any major consequences. However, it'll be picked up by Galileo later on, and there will be some problems there. Galileo will actually be put under house arrest by the church for supporting the heliocentric theory. The church felt that this was a stab at their power. Johannes Kepler, famous for the finding that planets orbit in ellipses and not circles, because the math doesn't work out. These scientists are using math. That's how Copernicus proved. He studied the stars for 25 years, and he did the math. And he says it doesn't make sense that the Earth would be center of the universe. It can't mathematically exist. Now, probably the greatest scientist of all time was an Englishman named Isaac Newton, who revolutionizes the study of physics. Of course, you know him famously for his laws of gravity and how important they are to the scientifically led world we live in now. All of these were incredibly rigorous challenges to church doctrines. This is a stab at church power. And again, it's aided by the fact that the Reformation has happened. Look at our dates. Reformation's 1515 with Martin Luther. We're talking 50 years later, you got all these scientists who are daring to go against the church. Um, Women in science, you get this guy named William Harvey who scientifically proves innate female inferiority. Not a very good scientist, I would assume, if he made a stupid statement like that. But hey, scientists are getting better and better as well. Um, you get this Emily du Châtelet. Sorry about my French. She's a French mathematician and physicist who translated Newton's basically laws of gravities into French. You will get some women in this time period, not much, but they're coming. The Enlightenment, again, the Enlightenment really is a movement against both the church and absolute monarchs. The trend is away from Aristotle's philosophy and church doctrine. They want rational thought and scientific analysis. One of the big dogs of this movement, probably the biggest dog as far as Americans are concerned, is John Locke, an Englishman. Also, Montesquieu from France. They attempt to discover natural laws of politics. John Locke is famous for believing that humans were uh, naturally good people that could improve, that could learn and be better. These guys want the church, they want the government, they believe that the government exists to serve the people, not the people exist to serve the monarch. And so that is revolutionary. France is definitely the center of the Enlightenment with their philosophers. Their most famous philosopher is probably Voltaire, who Voltaire attacks the powerful. He makes fun of the rich and powerful, of the nobles, of the church, to the point where he's exiled from France for 2 years. He famously says, "I don't agree with a single word you say, but I would defend to the death your right to say it." I believed in freedom of speech. A lot of American ideals are from the Enlightenment. Here he even talks about the Catholic Church and says, "Crush the damn thing." He sees the church as overbearing and not good for society. Deism becomes increasingly popular. Deism, there are some American deists like Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. They believed in God, but they believed that God was like a watchmaker, that he had created the universe and all that in it, and then he sits back and takes no active part, that he watches the pieces work, basically. There's a theory of progress with the Enlightenment. There's this assumption that the world is getting better, better and better and better for each generation that's coming. There's a decline in the authority of traditional organized religion. People are worshiping many different types of Christianity and on more personal levels. They're beginning not to show up on Sundays, believing that they can be godly without church, that there's a personal relationship with God. All right, that looks to be the end slide of a very long chapter. Make sure that you pause this as many times as you need so that you can take really good notes. This is a very important time period in world history. Thank you, guys.